que existe en distintas partes de nuestro planeta puedan ayudarnos, puedan iluminarnos al desafío que tiene Chile por delante. Antes de hacer una breve introducción y de presentar a nuestros invitados, quiero explicarles que este seminario tendrá traducción simultánea, ¿de acuerdo? Esto funciona de una manera muy simple. Para todas las personas que quieran acceder a la traducción simultánea, tienen que ir al icono donde, abajo a la derecha, donde dice interpretación, y hay un pequeño globo. Si ustedes quieren escuchar el audio original, esto es, cuando las personas hablen en inglés, las escucharán en inglés, y cuando las personas hablen en castellano, bueno, las escucharán en castellano, pongan apagado. Si quieren escuchar todo en inglés, presionen el botón inglés. Y si quieren escuchar todo en castellano, elijan esa opción. ¿De acuerdo? Es simple, la traducción simultánea ya está funcionando para todas las personas que lo necesiten. Como muchos saben, nuestro país está viviendo un momento muy importante y al mismo tiempo de mucha incertidumbre. Hemos iniciado un proceso constituyente y el 25 de octubre los chilenos votarán en un plebiscito si se abren o no y qué tipo de convención tendremos a la posibilidad de un proceso constituyente en los próximos meses. Sabemos que la construcción y elaboración de constituciones son una tarea difícil y que cumplen un rol fundamental, particularmente en un país que está viviendo una crisis múltiple, tanto en su dimensión política, en su dimensión social, en su dimensión sanitaria, como en su dimensión económica. Para Horizontal es un desafío contribuir a este proceso desde las ideas, desde los estudios, desde seminarios como este, para poder generar el mayor conocimiento posible frente a un proceso que sabemos tiene muchas preguntas por delante. Quiero agradecer en primer lugar a nuestros grandes invitados, estimados Cheryl, Tom y Sumit. Es un verdadero privilegio poder contar con su presencia, especialmente por el esfuerzo que ha implicado la coordinación y organización. Habrá que recordar de que tenemos a Tom en Chicago, a Sumit en Ámsterdam, en La Haya, y a Cheryl en Melbourne. Por tanto, hay en este minuto 4 usos horarios en forma simultánea. A todos ustedes les agradezco realmente la buena voluntad para poder acompañarnos y ayudar a nuestro país a tener un debate profundo respecto de experiencias internacionales y el desafío que tiene Chile. En segundo lugar, quiero agradecer a todas las personas que hicieron posible este seminario, a toda la gente horizontal y, por supuesto, a todos quienes nos acompañan. Finalmente, queremos agradecer a la Fundación Friedrich Neumann, que, como siempre, está apoyando distintos proyectos que desarrolla Horizontal. Este seminario no es una excepción. Vamos entonces a nuestro seminario. La organización será de la siguiente manera. Cada uno de nuestros expositores tendrá 20 minutos y luego tendremos 30 minutos para preguntas y respuestas. Les quiero pedir a todas aquellas personas que quieran hacer sus preguntas y respuestas que vayan al icono preguntas y respuestas. Nosotros haremos una selección y en los últimos 30 minutos le haremos las preguntas a nuestros invitados. Nos acompaña en primer lugar la profesora Cheryl Saunders, profesora emérita de la Universidad de Melbourne, donde fue directora fundadora de su Centro de Estudios Constitucionales Comparados. La profesora Saunders es especialista en Derecho Constitucional Comparado, destacando su rol como asesora en los procesos de elaboración de nuevas constituciones en varios países del mundo. Luego nos acompaña el profesor Sumit Bisarya, doctor en Derecho en la Universidad de Columbia, quien ha dedicado su vida profesional a trabajar en procesos de reforma o elaboración de nuevas constituciones en una variedad de contextos y países, incluyendo a Chile, en el proceso del 2016. Entre otras experiencias, ha trabajado como jefe del programa de procesos de formación de constituciones en el Instituto IDEA Internacional. Y finalmente, el profesor Tom Ginsburg, que es profesor de Derecho Internacional y Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Chicago, miembro de la Academia Estadounidense de las Artes y las Ciencias, y un conocido experto en Derecho Constitucional comparado. El profesor Ginsburg también ha trabajado como asesor legal en numerosos casos internacionales de elaboración de nuevas constituciones. Sin más, vamos a dejar a la profesora Cheryl Saunders. Agradecerte, Shirley, que nos acompañes. Shirley presentará una exposición denominada, un momento, tengo una pequeña confusión.
Hold that. Hold on.
Hold on. Here we go.
Here we go. Well, thank you, Hernan, for that introduction. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you and to offer what insights we can on the threshold of this very important constitutional period in Chile. So as Hernan mentioned, I'm coming to you from Melbourne, where, like many other parts of the world, we're in lockdown thanks to COVID-19, but it's good that we have the technology that enables us to get together in this way. So my responsibility in this session is to examine the issues that arise in preparing for designing and operating a constitutional convention to make a new constitution. So in other words, I'm looking at the process and whatever insights can be gathered from international experience, from the internal point of view of a convention. And my colleagues will look at the issues from other perspectives. So what I'd like to do in my 20 minutes is run through a series of topics, and they're here on the slide. The features of the Chilean process. What is it about the situation in Chile that affects the process that need to be taken into account? I'd like to say something briefly about the 2/3 voting requirements, a little bit about the goals of the Constitutional Convention, which I think can help us think about some of the issues that might arise. Questions about whether principles and convention committees might be helpful in the process. Some issues about the point at which a complete draft of the Constitution comes before the convention. And then finally, last but not least, we get to the question of the rules for the convention, their style and their content. And then right at the end, I'd like to say a little bit about leadership in the light of the remarks I've made already. So let's begin by thinking about the features of the Chilean process. There have, of course, been a lot of constitution-making exercises around the world over the last 3 decades or so, and many of those have involved elected bodies drawing up new constitutions. They take a variety of forms, but there is quite a lot of experience around. But what I want to do in this slide is to record my own understanding based on some of the briefings that we've had from Hernan and his colleagues about the things that are characteristic features of the Chilean process, which will certainly shape the convention process in one way or another. Now, the most obvious feature is that the convention will be either wholly or partly elected. We'll know that by the end of October. But whatever the answer is on that issue, it will be dedicated to constitution making. It won't also be operating as a legislature. It's not a sovereign or constituent body. And the vast majority of members will be politicians, one assumes from the election process. The convention is of what I would describe as a manageable size. On the scale of the size of elected constituent bodies, it is on the smallish side, and I think that the numbers make it quite manageable and useful for your purposes. Importantly, if the process doesn't result in a new constitution, once you go through the plebiscite and the other events that will follow that, the rules provide that the existing constitution will be retained. And that throws up a range of incentives that are very important for the process. There's a significant downstream constraint, at least in the form of a plebiscite. And I'm using this term downstream restraint here to pick up an idea floated many decades ago now by John Elster, who pointed to the fact that processes both before a convention can affect the way in which the convention is likely to operate, and processes after the convention also will have a constraint or an effect on the way in which the convention works. And I suspect my colleagues will pick up this idea themselves in other ways. The second last set of issues that are distinctive in Chile, aspects of the procedure have already been determined by the constitutional amendments. And they include things that in other contexts are sometimes quite contentious. So the duration of the convention, the arrangements for the secretariat, the arrangements for voting for the chair, and the dispute resolution procedure are now known. And then the final issue that occurs to me to mention at this point is, of course, the voting requirements, the two-thirds voting, majority voting requirement for each clause. Now, this two-thirds voting rule makes the Chilean process quite distinctive insofar as it's attached to each clause of the draft constitution. But every constitution-making process has hurdles that it needs to deal with, and this is just part of the Chilean process. It's a constraint with which the convention needs to work. Unlike some other processes, it makes the voting arrangements in Chile quite inflexible. You don't have the opportunity to waive the requirement or soften it a bit in particular instances. It precludes you putting in place a deadlock procedure if the two-thirds majority can't be achieved. It maybe raises questions about the attendance rule. Many other conventions have a rule that you must have at least two-thirds of the members present in the chamber, for example, when you're taking particular votes. But in Chile, that figure attaches to the voting requirements, as I understand them. And there's also a question about whether the two-thirds voting procedure applies in committees, which seems to me to be not practicable. We might come back to that when we look at the committees. On the other hand, the idea that there are supermajority voting requirements for parts of a constitution-making process is by no means an unusual idea. It can be quite controversial, but it's used in many different contexts. And indeed, the idea that what you should aim at in a constitution-making process is what's sometimes been described as sufficient consensus is also a familiar idea. So in a sense, what Chile has done with this two-thirds voting requirement is to formalize the idea of sufficient consensus around a particular proportion of the voting members. And so the result of this is to place a premium on negotiation and the overall effectiveness of the convention process. Now, I think it might be helpful in thinking about the workings of the convention to begin with the goals, to plan the working of the convention by reference to what you hope to get out of it. And the most important goal, of course, is to agree on a new constitution, and not just any old new constitution, but one that suits Chilean needs, one that is clear, accessible, and workable in its context, one that's regarded as legitimate, not only within the convention, but outside it, and ideally one that's likely to be supported by the plebiscite. So those are the obvious goals that circulate around the need for the convention to produce a constitution. But there are potentially other goals that you might set for the convention. Most obviously, if the convention works well, it could assist to consolidate a greater sense of national unity, a greater sense of national purpose, and it could encourage a commitment to implementation of the new constitution on all sides of politics, a very important outcome if that can be achieved. And there may indeed be other goals that those of you who are working with the convention choose to identify. And so the question for the rest of this session is, well, how then should the convention work in order to achieve those goals? Now, some constitutional processes begin by talking about the principles on which the constitution should be based. South Africa quite famously did that, and I'll come back to that example in a moment. But other constitutional processes do the same. The Indian process, now many decades ago, began by talking about the objectives of the constitution. South Africa was unusual for two reasons. One, the constitution makers agreed the principles before the constituent body began its deliberations. And secondly, there was a judicial process to guarantee that the constitution conformed with the principles. And that neither of those things are necessary in the Chilean context. So but the idea that I'm floating here is the possibility that the convention might begin by thinking about principles or objectives on which the new constitution might be based. That sort of approach has some advantages. It can certainly help to frame the debate. You've got to start somewhere in a constitutional convention, and starting with chapter 1 is not terribly practical. So to start with principles is a way of getting people's heads around the challenges that lie ahead. Arguably, dealing with principles can help to build consensus, can perform an educative function for members of the convention who haven't thought a lot about constitutions in the past, if there are such members. And it might also, in the Chilean context, help to identify the areas for major change as opposed to those parts of the existing constitution that you just plan to roll over into the new constitution. So I think principles could be useful for that reason. But principles are not always the answer. Some of the literature talks about the disadvantages of principles. Depending on what they are, they can be overly complicated. I think you don't want too many principles in any event. They could constrain the options for the constitution makers. And depending on the context, they could aggravate divisions by bringing up right at the outset of the convention things that are likely to be controversial. So it's really over to those of you who understand the Chilean context better than I do to think about whether this would be a useful technique in Chile and how it would work with the constraints on the substance of the Constitution that are already in Article 135 of the current Constitution. The second starting point, not instead of principles, but in addition to them, for a convention is the idea of committees. Almost all large constitution-making bodies use committees in some way to focus deliberations, to streamline them, to enable depth of examination of particular issues that are regarded as being important. And what I'm trying to identify in this part of the presentation is to get you to think about the sorts of committees that might be required. The most obvious ones are what are sometimes called thematic committees, or committees dealing with substantive aspects of the new constitution. And if you think about it, even the process of working out what the substantive committee should deal with is itself a process of beginning to frame the new constitution. What are the priorities? What are the difficult parts of this exercise? What do we really need a committee to explore? So thematic committees are a very important dimension of the process. But any convention is likely to need procedural committees of various kinds as well, maybe to deal with relations with the media, problems with the convention process itself, some of the issues with public involvement, which Sumit will be talking about later. Then you need, I think, a steering committee. It need not be called that, but a committee that's able to run the convention as a whole, very often a committee of quite senior people in the process. And then certainly at some stage towards the end of the committee process, or maybe during it as well, you need some other generalist committee that's capable of pulling the reports from the different thematic committees together to ensure a degree of consistency. Now, there's all sorts of logistical questions wrapped up with that. How many committees should there be? How many members on each? I think given the number of the size of the Chilean committee, you could be thinking of maybe thematic committees with, say, 20 members on. There are questions about how members are chosen, how to make them representative of the convention as a whole. And there are questions about choosing committee chairs, again, to ensure fair dealing within the committee. Notwithstanding the committee process, there will be a point in the convention when at long last a complete draft of a constitution will be available for debate, no doubt clause by clause. That happens in different ways, in different processes. There are some processes that deliberately provide some preliminary body to produce a full draft of a convention for debate, the full draft of a constitution for debate in the convention. I suspect that will not be appropriate in Chile. Sometimes a stakeholder produces a draft so as to get in early influence. That happened in Timor-Leste, for example, where the first draft that was produced proved extremely influential. But sometimes always, and I imagine this is what will happen in Chile, the draft is compiled from the reports of the thematic committees. And in that case, it takes us back to the idea I raised in an earlier slide that you very badly need a single committee or group with responsibility for integrating the reports from the thematic committees and resolving inconsistencies, ruthlessly if necessary. That committee is likely also to need the assistance of a professional drafter and may also need the assistance of legal experts. And the South African process was quite interesting in this regard. The debate on the complete draft in the plenary of the convention is likely to take quite a lot of time, and that again is something for which allowance must be made. So now let me move to the question of the rules in the light of the requirements I've talked about already. Clearly the rules for the convention, the working rules, should be drafted to facilitate the goals. We talked a little bit about the goals earlier. It can take a long time to debate and agree on rules. Some of the experiences elsewhere in the world, in Tunisia, in Timor-Leste, for example, are experiences where it's taken weeks and sometimes months for the rules to be agreed in the convention. And in Chile, the length of the convention means you don't have 5 months to talk about rules. So clearly that's something that needs to be done in advance and streamlined as far as possible at the beginning of the convention process. The rules should be clear, no more complicated than is necessary, but should anticipate the procedural issues that are likely to arise. There's a question where you get the ideas from. There's quite a lot of draft rules from various constituent bodies that you can get on the internet, or I'm sure IDEA can make available to you. But they do need to be adapted to Chilean experience. So the rules that Congress uses may provide some sort of a guide, but again, the rules for a convention need also to make allowance for the different purposes and indeed different culture, ideally, that operates in a convention. So adapting the rules that others have used, adapting the rules of Congress can be useful ideas, but at the end of the day, they need to be rules that work in the Chilean context. And I thought I should add at this point also that some thought it needs also to be given to the configuration of the physical spaces in which the committees, the convention itself and its committees will meet, so as to encourage deliberation and try to break down unnecessary divisiveness. Matters for inclusion in the rules, it's sort of an endless list potentially, and you can get some ideas about the sorts of things that other people have thought might be useful just by skimming the rules that have been used in other bodies. But I've selected in this slide the matters that seem to me to be particularly pertinent. Many conventions or assemblies begin with the members taking an oath as they're sworn in. If you're going to take an oath at the beginning, you need an oath to take. And there's a question about what that oath might say. The rules need to provide for the formation of the committees, a very important dimension of them. Importantly also, they need to provide timelines for the convention overall. How long in plenary, how long in committees, how long debating the complete draft. There need to be quite detailed and I think complex arrangements for the management of daily business, including the timely distribution and publication of agendas and minutes, arrangements for moving, amending and voting on motions, speaking rules, rules about the authority of the chairperson, decisions about which part of the proceedings are public and which are not. Again, the literature gives you all sorts of different views on this, but I find it very hard these days to imagine a constituent assembly in which most of the plenary, at least, is not held in public, although perhaps the committees may not be. And then there are rules to deal with unexpected contingencies. What happens if there's a vacancy in the membership of the convention? Does that vacancy need to be filled? And if so, how might that be done? So there's a range of issues, and I'm sure you can think of other sorts of questions that might need to be provided for in these very technical but important rules. And then finally, let me conclude by saying just a little bit about leadership, because leadership of some kind can be critical in the success of a constitutional convention. And you can see from the points that I've made already that there's all sorts of moments in the process when leadership can really matter. When you're drawing together principles, when you're drawing together rules, when you're negotiating over contentious clauses that are nevertheless significant. All of those points need leadership, not necessarily a single leader, but a leadership from across the convention as a whole. And I think that the need for a 2/3 vote on all the clauses suggests that some sort of leadership across the political spectrum in the convention can be useful. You might, just to put some substance in this idea, pay some attention at some stage to the South African experience, where the role of leadership was critically important, and leadership at different levels. Within the convention itself, there were very senior leaders who could resolve major issues or major controversies. But if they failed, there was yet another port beyond them. You could go up to Nelson Mandela and his opposite number, de Klerk, to finally resolve matters. And I've given you a link on the slide to a wonderful DVD called Deadline, which gives you the last 2 weeks of the South African Constituent Assembly process, when they have just a few issues that they still need to work out before the convention period ends. And it's a very inspiring DVD to watch, to see how you can get a very good atmosphere working in a convention, and how important leadership can be in that capacity. And just a final point for an idea of a very different kind, in Kenya, in the absence of much obvious leadership, I suspect, one of the Constituent Assembly members decided instead to put together his own consensus building committee. I'm not sure how effective it was, but it was a nice idea. And again, it's another example of leadership. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the question period.
Muchas gracias, Cheryl, por tu clarísima exposición. Sin duda una gran contribución a una serie de preguntas que hay en Chile respecto de cómo organizar, cómo planificar y cómo aprender de otras experiencias para diseñar y pensar el proceso que está viviendo en Chile. Realmente una gran contribución y por supuesto que vamos a compartir tu presentación y ese video para que las personas que nos acompañen y otras personas interesadas puedan conocerlo. Quiero brevemente recordar que existe la posibilidad, aquellos que se han sumado después, de poder escuchar este seminario con traducción simultánea. Abajo a la derecha hay un pequeño botón que dice interpretación, ¿cierto? Y pueden elegir apagado, inglés o español, y de esa manera ustedes pueden escuchar en distintos idiomas las presentaciones. A continuación, nos acompaña Sumit Bisarya. Su exposición se ha denominado El camino chileno, qué aprender y qué no aprender de los procesos constitucionales internacionales. En esta exposición, el profesor Bisarya complementará la gran exposición de Cheryl sobre el funcionamiento de la Convención, centrándose en los mecanismos externos que pueden afectar la elaboración de la Constitución, específicamente la ciudadanía, ¿cierto? Y los distintos mecanismos de participación, los medios de comunicación y los plazos. Estimado Sumit, por favor, adelante.
Thanks very much. Thanks to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Hernan, Sebastian, and Horizontal for the invitation. As Hernan mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be in Santiago a few times in 2015, 2016. And it's a real pleasure to be with you virtually today. And we hope before too long the conditions might allow that I could visit Santiago again. Really a lovely and vibrant city. Apologies that I cannot speak to you in Spanish. Thanks in advance to the interpreter. I have a bad habit of speaking too fast, so please, to the interpreter, if I do that, then just let me know. Before I start, what I wanted to do is just pick up on one word that Hernan mentioned in his introduction, which was uncertainty. And I thought I have some good news and some bad news about that word. The bad news, perhaps I'll start with, is that I think it's very hard to have any certainty about constitution-making processes. In my work, I've been very lucky to travel around the world and visit lots of different processes. And I think very few of us have any answers to questions that you might have. We have very few answers that have real predictive certainty to say, well, Chile could do this or Chile should do that, because each process is so unique. And already what we've seen in the Chile process from the November 15th agreement onwards, and some of the driving factors that led to that agreement, the Chile process is already very, very different from any other process, I think, that I've worked in or that I've seen. I think the best thing that we can do, people like myself, is that because we're very lucky to speak to lots of people who are engaged in these same questions in their own contexts, is share some of those conversations and share some of those considerations. So hopefully that Chileans, who at the end of the day are going to be the ones to determine the destiny of this process, can make more informed decisions. The good news about the uncertainty is I think that's a good sensation at this moment in the process. Constitution-making processes, they don't always go as planned. I will talk about that a little bit later. They're not very linear. And I find that often people enter these processes with a bit too much certainty. And so I think at this stage in the process, a bit of humility, a bit of prudence, not fear, optimism, A little bit of uncertainty is probably a good thing, because if the referendum approves a constituent process, there's going to be lots of considerations and factors for Chileans to tackle along the way. And what I hope today is to talk about some of those. Cheryl has covered very comprehensively sort of inside the convention. And what I want to do is talk to you a bit about the people that you see up in this window. And to me, so this is a picture of the French Constituent Assembly in the late 1700s. And for the purposes of these presentation, these people up in these windows represent the external factors acting on the Constituent Assembly. And I'm going to pick 3 of those to speak about. Every process is unique, and there may be others in Chile, but I'm going to speak in particular about the public, the media, and the factor of time. So as Cheryl mentioned, this is quite a famous paradigm or schematic for constitution making that was written about 25 years ago now by a chap called John Elster. And I repeat it everywhere I go because I think that it is not only a brilliant academic study of constitution making, but nearly all processes that I have seen exhibit a lot of the stuff that Elster talks about. And in particular, what Elster is telling us in this paradigm is that the constituent power, regardless of when and how it's created, the constituent power in this constituent assembly never acts completely unconstrained. This mighty constituent power always has some constraints on it. And Elster really talks about 2 of those constraints that Cheryl has mentioned. There must be someone that convenes the convention or the assembly, and that act will constrain the assembly in some way. It may give it a mandate, it may set principles, as Cheryl discussed. The selection process itself will define the composition and therefore constrain or influence in some ways the discussions. And then often you have a referendum, an exit referendum, as you're calling it in Chile, which the constitution makers must take into account, because whatever product they will have must pass the referendum. So that's sort of a downstream constraint on their thinking. But what I want to talk to you about is some other factors, some other forces that will act on this constitutional convention if it comes to pass in Chile during the constitution making debates. And I find that a lot of the studies that we read about constitution making, they talk a lot about what's happening in the assembly, the political negotiations, the deals that are made, the bargaining. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the factors that commonly take place and constrain or influence in some way the constitution making debates. I'm going to start with the role of the public. And so here I sort of sketched out a few bullet points which are absolutely pouring with rain in the Netherlands here. So I don't know if that's coming through on the microphone, but I'm in an absolute, but I hope you can hear me clearly. So I sketched out here some bullet points about the role of the public, right? So in the late 1800s, we had this idea from Thomas Paine that the Constitution is not the act of a government, it is the act of the people constituting a government. So a constitution is some sort of higher law which draws its power from the sovereign people, and the government is a creation, therefore, of the people. Skip forward almost a couple of hundred years, and in the ICCPR, we have an international human rights commitment that all people have a right to freely determine their political status and to participate in public affairs. That's ICCPR Articles 1 and 25. And the UN Committee on Human Rights has specifically said that this includes the right to choose the form of their constitutions, right? So this has really become a universal norm, that constitutions are no longer going to be made by groups of elites in smoky rooms behind closed doors, but the public is going to play some sort of a role. For many, many years, that role, I think, was mostly limited to electing a constitution-making body or ratifying or rejecting the Constitution in referendum. But in the last 20, 30 years, what we've seen is a much more expanded role of the public, in particular through public consultations. To use a very loose term, it can take many forms. And in a recent paper written by International IDEA and Contransnet, Constitutional Transformation Network, of which Cheryl is a principal, direct public participation is now regarded as an essential part of a constitution building process. And so no matter where the process whether it be Vietnam 2013, South Sudan 2020, or Norway 2014, we always now see people who are designing constitution-making processes thinking about how to involve the public, often beyond the sort of legally required referendum or elections to the constitution-making body. And then lastly, there's this catchy little quotation from a chap called Ivor Jennings, who was a British constitutional advisor in the post-colonial times. And what he says is, well, that's all well and good. You know, the people can decide. But before the people can decide, someone has to decide who are the people. And what I mean by this, in this particular context, is someone at some point is going to have to design a process to consult the public. And we have many different conceptions of what the public are, what the people are, right? So in your exit referendum, the people are defined as 50% plus one Chilean, right? So constitutions that are adopted at referendum or other constitutions, they will say, no, we the people, or in the name of the people. That people, if it's at a referendum, is defined by 50% plus one. But there are other ways in which the the constitution-making body, during its operation, will have to figure out, what do we mean here when we say we're consulting the public? And I'm going to give you some examples in just a moment. But before I do that, here are some general thoughts that occurred to me about the role of the public and public participation during the time of the constitution-making body. Firstly, it's necessary. It's become such a norm that people will demand to be involved beyond elections and the referendum. I remember being in one constitution-making body's inaugural meeting. They got together for their first meeting and they had international experts come and tell them about various things. And one was talking about the virtues of public participation because it's an international human right and it leads to a more democratic populace and people will become guardians of the constitutions. And most of these sort of normative arguments fell on deaf ears. But then one guy said, look, and this was a chap who chaired a constitution-making body previously, he said, look, if you don't engage the public, then you're going to be criticized for not engaging the public. You have to do it. It's become a norm. And so I think there's no escaping that. So the constitution-making body will not have to decide whether to engage the public, but how and when to engage the public. A second point, different levels of participation for different groups. I think this is a mistake often made by people engaging the public. So the people attending this seminar, for example, that I'm sure are quite well informed and have a more nuanced, more sophisticated understanding of what constitution-making processes look like. If I were going to consult this group, that might look very different to consulting people in rural areas that have different concerns and different types of expertise. And so I think the constitution-making body needs to think about how do we engage different sectors of our society. Coming back to the Ivor Jennings quote, you need to define particular groups for consultations. In every society, the people don't act as a group of unrelated citizens. We act in communities, in groups, and how you're going to engage those groups to somehow articulate a voice of the people will be an important challenge. And I'm going to give a couple of examples in just a second. And lastly, managing expectations. This is an almost impossible task. I've never been to a process where the people felt, all right, you've consulted us enough. We're quite happy. There's always demands for more consultation. There's always some group that feels that they haven't been consulted enough, feels excluded. I think the best, and there's always groups that feel like, well, we said, I don't know, the president should be elected by 50+1, and they chose a plurality rule for the election of the president. So they didn't listen to the people. And so I think managing expectations about how many people realistically the constitution-making body can reach and what will be the effect of those consultations. It is not, I think, the duty of the constitution-making body to transcribe everything that the public says, because the public often speaks in different voices and contradicts itself. But I think it is the duty of the constitution-making body to explain up front to the public how their inputs will be taken into consideration and to produce some sort of report post facto to say, here's what we did with all this public input. Because really what's at stake here is the legitimacy of the process and the legitimacy of the constitution that comes out of that process. So here's some examples that you may be familiar with. I'm going to speak about Ireland, Iceland, and Italy as three contrasting examples. Recent examples, very different from Chile in their design, in their triggering events, but they just illustrate a couple of things that I wanted to point out. So in Ireland, 2016, 2017, they had a sort of randomly selected body of 100 citizens, came together to discuss 5 different issues, one of which was the 8th Amendment, which is related to abortion. And so here you had a body which was the public. It was 100 citizens randomly selected and weighted to be representative of the population in terms of age, region, and gender. And so in some ways, this body might think, well, we are the public, we are the citizens, so let's just get on with it, and we'll make our decisions and our recommendations. But what they did was they decided to consult with the public. And if you go on their website, you can see all the consultations that they did, and I've just listed some of them here. So they consulted with GPs, family doctors, who have been with patients who have who wanted abortions or not, professors of ethics, churches, women's interest groups, pro-life groups. And they involved all these people in their deliberations, all these interest groups. Eventually, they made a recommendation for repeal of the 8th Amendment to allow Parliament to legislate on restrictions on abortion, and the referendum approved. Now, my sense, having spoken to the people that managed this assembly, is not that the pro-life groups or the churches had their minds changed. It's not that they actively consented to repealing the 8th Amendment. But what I do think happened is, because the process was so inclusive and deliberative and took their recommendations seriously, I think those groups acquiesced. And here, I don't know how this is going to sound in Spanish, but I think there's a difference between active consent to something, where you will say, yeah, absolutely, I agree with this, we should do this, and acquiescence, which to me is a sort of lack of opposition, a lack of, you go along with something and you don't reject it. And I think one of the objectives of a constitution-making process is as broad as acquiescence as possible. And acquiescence often comes not from the results, because you may not consent to the results, but because you agreed that the process itself was just and legitimate. So that's Ireland. Iceland is very famous. Recent process. It was very innovative. It was very exciting. Again, it starts with a randomly selected body. Then they end up with a few detours through a 25-member Constitutional Council. And that Constitutional Council had a website. And the chair of this Constitutional Council, I wrote his words here. I've spoken about this with him, and he's written about this. And he basically said, look, we had a website which had an open invitation to the public. So the public could contribute, and we were open to, we got 300 contributions from the public, and we took them into account. But because we did that, this chap, Thorvaldur Gilbertson, he says, it was unnecessary, if not inappropriate, to invite representatives of interest groups to meet with the council. Right? So you can see that clearly contrasts with the Irish group that also had a website and also opened themselves up to public input, but actively and deliberately sought out interest groups to try and include them in their deliberations. What ends up happening in Iceland is you had this beautiful process driven from the bottom up rather than top down by groups of citizens not involving politicians at all, but eventually it has to get to Parliament, and the politicians essentially kill that draft constitution. It's never put to vote. One of the reasons why it was never put to vote is there was a very important group of Icelandic citizens who happened to also be businessmen, and they were members of the fishing industry. And one of the things in that constitution, in that draft constitution, that had changed was the way that licenses and quotas for fishing work. And so certainly in the subsequent process, when Parliament essentially rejected the draft that had been drafted by Citizens' Assembly and put forward its own draft, that group that had been excluded from consultations sort of acted as a spoiler and opposed the draft. Lastly, process close to my heart, my wife is Italian, is the Italy experience of a couple of years ago. This was, I think, 2016, I suppose. So the two processes I've spoken about before have been very driven by the public. One of them with Ireland, you sort of involved interest groups, you involved political groups, and you got to a consensual solution. Whether everyone agreed with it or not, they acquiesced, I think. In Iceland, you had a situation where politicians were excluded, the public drove the entire process, and the draft failed. In Italy, you have a purely political exercise, really. Constitutional reform in Italy, especially of the legislature, they have a strange bicameral system. No one really knows why the Senate is composed the way it is and why it does the things it does. It's very unusual comparatively. And it's been on the reform agenda for decades. Finally, Prime Minister Renzi is appointed, I think, 2014. He says this is going to be a priority. He proposes a very broad constitutional reform, not just the legislature, but also the way decentralization and the regions work, appointments to the Constitutional Court, all kinds of things. And for the first time in Italian history, he doesn't really attempt a broad political consensus outside his governing coalition. He has the numbers in his governing coalition to pass a draft which can go to referendum. And so he doesn't really engage with the opposition. He doesn't engage with the public at all, beyond thinking that they're going to ratify this at referendum. And it's really something that is done behind, this picture is the Senate, behind the doors of the Italian parliament, amongst politicians, amongst the ruling parties in the coalition. The other thing that Renzi decides to do is that he declares the referendum as a vote of confidence. He says, this referendum is about me and my government, and if the referendum fails, I resign as prime minister. And I think all these things together had the effect of making this constitutional reform, which was very important and is very important still for the Italian political system, seem really as something that's about politics. It's not really about Italian society. They didn't involve the public at all beyond referendum. And sure enough, in the referendum, and there are many reasons for this, of course, but it was rejected at referendum. Two more issues I shall cover quite quickly are the media and time. This photo is from the Pennsylvania Packet, which was a newspaper, no longer exists, I think, the late 1800s. And if you ever go to Philadelphia in the National Constitution Center, the museum, they have the original of this newspaper, which when the Philadelphia Convention closed, it printed copies of the draft constitution so people could see it. And of course, as we know, after the convention closed, there was a series of articles in newspapers, the Federalist and anti-Federalist papers, whereby proponents and opponents of the Constitution were making their arguments. So that's all to say that the media is always involved in constitution making and can play a really important role. I think one thing that Cheryl's already mentioned in terms of leadership is the convention needs to get out ahead of this issue and should have a professional communications staff used to dealing with the media and a communication strategy. A question for the convention to tackle is whether all sessions would be open to the media, whether some sessions would be closed, what would be the defaults or the ways in which sessions should be closed. I know Tom is going to speak a bit about the issue of secrecy, so I will just leave that as a question for now. One thing that I don't see happen very often, but I do think should happen, is there should be training for journalists. Very often these processes, they come along once in a generation. You know, Chile's never had this type of convention. The journalists need to be helped in order to understand, in order to ask the right questions. I think in my experience, I see sort of 20% of journalists that have been partisan in their reporting, 20% that just don't care, and the other 60% often report just based on lack of understanding. And I think one thing perhaps think tanks like Horizontal or wherever would be the appropriate forum should consider is how do we make sure that the journalists are informed about key questions about the Constitution and sort of the fundamentals of the process and of constitutional design. And lastly, we now live in a world that is lived half in real life and half in the virtual world, and social media is a big part of how people perceive politics and how people perceive constitution-making processes. And it's very contextual, but what I will do is give one example, which I think highlights a couple of interesting things in terms of social media. I think it was a good use of social media. That's the experience of Tunisia. Constituent Assembly was there 2012, 2014. So what they did in that case was they made an agreement with one NGO that said, we're going to give you full access based on these rules of engagement with the constituent assembly. And so that NGO had access to all proceedings. It was able to monitor proceedings. It had a wonderful website. It tweeted live debates. This deputy says this deputy says that. I remember following them. It was really great to be able to follow the debates live. They had a daily record of attendees and absentees, so there's sort of transparency in terms of are our representatives actually there and doing what they should be doing, and publishing of the votes immediately throughout the process. And I thought this was good for a couple of reasons. One, it instilled a lot of faith and legitimacy in what's happening. It also engaged a lot of young people who obviously follow Twitter more than they do perhaps traditional news. But secondly, I think it was a smart decision by the Assembly by making a partnership with this NGO. I think they bestowed on the NGO not just the privilege of access, but also a sense of responsibility. And I know a couple of other processes. Romania comes to mind in the post-Cold War period, where constitution-making bodies have sought out partnerships with civil society organizations so that those CSOs are not seen as opponents to monitor us and watch us, but partners to help us fulfill our mandate. Last, but I stress definitely not least, is the issue of time. Every process thinks they have more time than they do. I don't think 6 + 3 months is an awful lot of time. I think it might be enough time, but it's not an awful lot of time. And so a very easy thing to say is that the convention shouldn't waste time at the start. I think if we see 2 or 3 months of haggling over procedural rules, the convention is really going to be behind the 8 ball in terms of making sure they can come up with a draft. One thing you never read about in the Elsters or the Negrettos or the Aratos, the people who write about constituent assemblies, but I've seen very often is the difference that a strong secretariat can make. These are sort of the parliamentary clerks of constituent assemblies who are going to be responsible for things like media, things like public participation, and just the operational functioning to make sure that the convention can do its job. Really important, I think, for investment in the secretariat in terms of financial and human resources to help it support the constitution-making body. Politics doesn't stop for constitution-making. Momentum will change during the process. It's not much one can say except for, it's good to get things done early because you never know what can happen down the road. We know from Gabriel Negretto that external shocks and crises can often encourage consensus. That's one of his drivers towards cooperative outcomes in constitution making, but they can also take attention away from constitution making itself. The one thing about Chile that makes my eyes widen is the fact that elections will happen during the debates of the constitution making process. So there's a couple of obvious implications of that. One is, does campaigning and attention on the elections help the constitution making body? Because maybe it can get on with its work without too much attention. Everyone's focused on elections. Does it hinder the constitution making body because parties are more focused on the presidential congressional elections? But also, how will the composition of the new Congress affect incentives for bargaining within the Assembly? Especially given the rule regarding sort of if a provision is not agreed by 2/3, it's sort of left empty to be filled in by legislation. If I control the first Congress, am I going to be looking at that when I'm looking at my the incentives for coming to consensus during the constitution-making body? And lastly, processes are linear. How to prepare for the unexpected. I think in 2020, we're all getting better for preparing for the unexpected. It's been an unusual year, but I think to go into a process and think that here's the plan, here's our roadmap, and here's the timeline, and it's going to work like this, usually it doesn't. So I shall end there. It's taken more than my 20 minutes. Thanks a lot again to the organizers for the invitation.
Great. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Sumit. Excelente exposición, muy complementaria con Cheryl, ¿cierto? Los factores externos, sabemos, son un elemento fundamental. Hay varias cosas que aprender de otras experiencias, así que muchas gracias por eso. Quiero recordarles que vamos a tener algunos minutos para preguntas. Yo les agradezco que ustedes, ahí en la sección de preguntas y respuestas, digan a quién quieren hacerle la pregunta y la hagan en castellano. Les pido por favor que lo hagan en castellano para poder respetar la forma en que está estructurado esto, donde como moderador estamos hablando en castellano y hay traducción simultánea para los expositores. Finalmente, nuestro profesor Tom Ginsburg nos va a presentar lecciones claves que entrega la experiencia comparada en los procesos de elaboración de una constitución. Como ustedes podrán haber observado, hay una coordinación entre los tres expositores para poder aportar desde distintas dimensiones y ángulos a la pregunta que nos estamos haciendo. ¿Cómo podemos aprender de otras experiencias internacionales? Tom, la palabra es tuya.
Gracias, Hernan. Buenos días a todos y todas. Y muchas gracias a Horizontal por esta oportunidad de pensar en los problemas de este momento crucial en la historia de Chile. Discúlpeme porque no puedo expresar mis ideas en español, así que hablaré solamente en inglés. So I want to follow up on my colleagues and focus on, very quickly, by the way, on just a few lessons, 5 lessons that we can take from the experience of other countries. And, you know, I think the 3 of us have been involved in many dozens of processes around the world. And so there are some things we can learn very quickly. First one is a very basic one. Don't fear the constituente. Now, it's not our position to advise how people should vote. Maybe people will reject, you know, moving forward with a new constitution. But when I was last in Santiago, I talked to many people who were very afraid of this moment that is coming, which is possibly a constituente, maybe even one that includes no members of the National Assembly. And looking around the world, I think the fear was rooted in the idea that Chile might somehow be like Bolivia or Venezuela or something, where one force would grab the constituent assembly and force things on the other side. We have looked at many constituent assemblies, and some of them don't work well for various reasons. But I think there's many reasons to think that Chile is a country in which a constituente can work well. I have 3 pictures here. One is the Constituent Assembly in the upper left of Egypt. And you can see the guys aren't paying very much attention to the proceedings. And then the other problem is in the lower left, which is the Constituent Assembly of Nepal. And there's fistfights and riots. But in the upper right, we have this image from Tunisia, which was an extremely contentious process. If you think about the differences in that society, even much greater than the differences in Chilean society. And they managed to have a process despite many, many problems. And so I think that, you know, it is feasible. I should say in general that the problem Chile is facing now is a very difficult one, right? It is as if Chile is about to go on a journey or deciding whether to go on a journey. And if Chile decides to go on the journey, time is very short. 9 months or a year is not a lot of time. Most constitution-making processes take longer than that. So time is short. It's a journey with no map, no guidebook, and one on which you know there will be unexpected events and dangers. It's as if a metaphor that I like to use is a narrow bridge. Constitution-making is a narrow bridge from the present to the future. And you can fall off the bridge. There's no guarantee of success. So it's a big challenge. And it's going to require parties to work together in a civil way, in an engaged way, to be much more like this Tunisian photo than the photo that occurred in Nepal. And I'm confident in that. Next, make sure there is space for bargaining and not just arguing. I want to explain what I mean. You know, and it has to do with some of the themes Sumit was talking about transparency. Some of you probably have had some experience in public debates and in legislatures and things like this. And we know that when the assembly is open to the public, then people tend not to be speaking to each other in the room, but they tend to be speaking to people outside. I was just testifying before the US Congress this week, and that's exactly what happened. All the congressmen asking me questions were not speaking to me. They were speaking to their publics. And that's useful, but the problem is it's arguing. It's making arguments. It's not making bargains. To get through this process is going to require some bargaining because of the 2/3 vote. There's no party is going to dominate and have a 2/3 majority. There's going to have to be negotiations and compromises. And that means you have to design the assembly so that bargaining can occur, which means some space for backroom discussions among the key actors. Jan Elster, who Sumit mentioned, uses the metaphor of the hourglass in thinking about public participation. The public participation in constitution making should be very wide at the beginning, at the top, as we are seeing next month with a public vote. And at the stage of gathering ideas, it should be very wide. And at the end, it should be very wide. You need a public blessing of the new constitution somehow. But in the middle, it's probably good to keep the public out of it. There will be demands for transparency, and Sumit talked about some of the techniques for dealing with them. But you have to also make sure that there's an ability for these constitution makers to bargain. And we have learned that sometimes there are techniques that can be used in a constituent assembly to do so. One thing that we've observed is that sometimes when there's a hard deadlock, to take the members of the constituent assembly away from the heat of the place, go on a retreat somewhere. In your case, leave, if it's held in Santiago or Valparaiso, go somewhere else to get people out so that they can negotiate and talk with each other as humans and not just be talking all the time to the people outside. So that's, I think, an important design element. Third lesson, don't decide everything, but there are certain things you have to decide. So, if you look around, the general problem is that constitutional design is always done under situations of great uncertainty, which my colleagues have talked about. But a key problem is the lack of information. I'm a social scientist and I study the effects of constitutions on politics and on the economy and society. And it is a very difficult field. That is, we don't have very many things that we can say with confidence, that this design choice will lead to that design choice. This is because constitutions are bundles of institutions. You have a system, it's presidential, it's parliamentary, there's some economic policy-making rules, there's courts, and all those things interact in ways that are sort of unique to any country. So it's very hard to draw comparative conclusions. I think we do better with saying which ideas do not work. It's easy to say that certain things are bad than to say that if you do this, this will happen. So that makes the problem of the drafters very difficult because they're operating under very deep uncertainty. We also observe that drafters will make mistakes, miscalculations, because they don't know everything that will happen. A very famous one occurred in my country, where the southern states accepted a 20-year ban on the slave trade. We won't import any new slaves for 20 years because we know that in 20 years, we're going to control the Congress. They thought the growth of the country would be in that part, in the southern part. But then something happened. Napoleon decided to go to war. He needed money, and he sold massive amount of territory to the United States. And that meant we had all this territory in the north and the northwest for people to settle. And that's where the new states were. And that meant that the South had miscalculated bad. And that created problems for us. So that kind of miscalculation is going to happen. And there's unintended consequences. So that means you can't put everything in there. But there are some things you must put in, right? Certain things are found in every constitution. The amendment rule, picking the president. Actually, one of the things I learned is that in my study is that most constitutions say something about education. It's one of the very core features in a constitution. I know it's a major political issue in the country. So there are certain things that will be included. I have no doubt that they will be there. But I would also encourage the drafters, if it's decided to go ahead, to find some symbolic issues, maybe early in the process, on which there's agreement. For example, it could be something small, recognizing the Mapuche in the preamble. You know, it doesn't cost anybody anything, but would indicate that this is a new process, it's an inclusive process, and it might help get the politics, the public on board to know that this is going to be something that's good. The final adoption is going to depend on the actual choices and their quality, but also on the public perception of those choices. And so looking for easy wins, as we say, I think is a good thing. Next thing, don't let the dead govern the living. What do I mean by this? Thomas Jefferson, our founding father in the United States, used to say, all constitutions should die after 19 years, because otherwise we're being governed by dead people, right? The current majority didn't make the rules that they're living under. And so he thought you should change constitutions every 20 years. That turns out not to be a great idea. But the idea of, it's related to don't decide everything, is leave room for the future to make their own decisions. And there's many ways to do this. It also is a good way to deal with deadlocks. So in South Africa, they decided to not say anything about the death penalty in the Constitution. And that was a way of avoiding a difficult issue. And it turned out soon afterwards, the court, Constitutional Court, decided there should be no death penalty. So that's okay. You can leave, you can be silent. You can, if there's disagreement about details, then you can leave things abstract. Some overarching word that allows everyone to be happy without being too specific, that it implicitly allows the future to govern itself in interpreting that word. I have studied something I call by-law clauses, where the Constitution will say, you know, this subject shall be regulated by the legislature. So in that case, you're identifying an important topic, but not making the decision. And this can be a good technique also for resolving deadlocks. And finally, I would use this term, I say sunset, rise and sunsets, to play with time. That if you're not certain about the solution that is adopted, allow a review of it later on. A famous example here was in Brazil in 1988. Their constituinte was deadlocked over presidential versus parliamentary system. And in the end, the presidentialistas won, but they said, okay, we're going to have a referendum in 5 years after trying presidentialism. And we'll see whether the public wants to keep it or not. And so that was a sunset provision in which the public then chose to keep presidentialism. So that's a nice technique. There's lots of these kind of things. The final lesson, and it'll be my last slide, so that we have time for questions, don't aim for perfection. There is no perfect constitution. There's going to be mistakes. And this is a long quote from Benjamin Franklin, which I will summarize. Basically, he says, you know, I don't think that there's many things I disagree with in this Constitution that we've just adopted, but I don't, and I may never approve them, because when you get a group of men and women, we will see, you know, together, they have all kinds of biases, and you're never going to get a perfect product. Nevertheless, I consent to this one because I don't think we could have done better in the time we had. And I think that humility of the process is going to be important for getting across the narrow bridge, to recognize that it's not going to be perfect, but it might be better from the point of view of the public than what they're living under. It might even just indicate a symbolic change, which will allow Chileans to feel like they've exercised their choice. So I think that's good guidance, that not to aim for perfection, to leave some things to the future, and just to be a bit humble in the process. One final point I will make is part of not aiming for perfection is remembering that the Constitution must be amended. And that means probably having an amendment rule that's not too high. Right now, the rule is 3/5, you know, for most things, 2/3 for others. I'm not saying if it's too high or low, but you have to recognize that you're going to have to make amendments, as Chile has amended the Constitution many times since 1988. Now, because time is short, I want to stop and open it up and hear the questions from the floor. And thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Tom. Muchas gracias a los tres porque sin duda aquí ha habido un trabajo, un compromiso y una preparación para que desde distintas perspectivas, desde distintas experiencias, nos puedan ayudar a iluminarnos y de esta manera poder enfrentar de mejor manera el desafío que tiene Chile. Tenemos varias preguntas, queremos cumplir y ser muy respetuosos con los tiempos. Recuerden que tenemos 4 usos de horario en forma simultánea y la profesora Saunders está en este minuto en Melbourne y es de noche. Y yo voy a leer... Tengo distintas preguntas y voy a partir con la profesora Saunders. ¿Okay? La profesora de Derecho Constitucional chilena Constanza V pregunta: el artículo 135 de la Constitución chilena establece límites de fondo para la Convención. Entre otras, Chile es una república democrática, respeto a los tratados internacionales, respeto a las sentencias judiciales firmes y ejecutoriadas, no intervenir en atribuciones de otras autoridades. Sin embargo, esos límites no tienen acción de reclamación. La profesora V pregunta: ¿existen experiencias comparadas donde no hayan acciones de reclamación? ¿En esas experiencias se han respetado esos límites de fondo? ¿Es clara la pregunta, profesora Saunders?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it is. The idea that you set up a constitution-making process and say certain things are off limits is reasonably familiar practice. And in fact, Sumit referred to it in his presentation. It's one of the upstream constraints that whoever initiated the process says, make a new constitution, but don't interfere with these things. Whether they're complied with or not is another question. I mean, famously in the United States, the Philadelphia Convention didn't comply with the limits. But for the most part, they are complied with. I was very interested in those constraints in Article 135, though, because they're so broad and general. And I assume that there's some Chilean understanding of what they actually encompass, which I think is an interesting thing for the convention to talk about what is preserved by those limits in Article 135.
Muchas gracias, profesora. Summit. Claudio Troncoso, también el profesor constitucionalista Sebastián Soto tienen una pregunta similar. ¿Cuánta transparencia y cuánta reserva debe existir en la deliberación del proceso constituyente? Todos compartimos de que altos niveles de transparencia es muy deseable, pero al mismo tiempo se corre el riesgo de que la deliberación sea más bien una conversación para complacer al público y que en instancias más reservadas existe la posibilidad, más probabilidades de llegar a soluciones y a ciertos arreglos, a ciertos compromisos. ¿Cómo gestionar, cómo administrar la tensión entre la transparencia y lo público y la deliberación y la capacidad de llegar a acuerdos en lo privado?
Yeah, so Elster, I think, comes down on the side of secrecy being better than transparency because of the issues that Tom raised, really, and that it avoids grandstanding and speaking to your constituents and political leaders becoming entrenched in their positions. You know, in Philadelphia, everything was very secret to such an extent that when it was very hot, because it was a hot summer, they wanted to open the shutters, but then passers-by would hear the debate. So they moved upstairs to a much smaller, cramped room just for secrecy. So secrecy is very important. A more recent example is Tunisia. The Constituent Assembly struggled for 2 years on some critical issues, which really only resolved in what was a very transparent Constituent Assembly when they had a closed meeting, which was convened by some powerful civil society forces like the unions, who brought the political parties together in debates which happened behind closed doors. It's not going to be a very satisfying answer, but I think that there needs to be a mix. A lot depends on the culture. If Chileans are used to watching televised hearings of Congress, then they would probably find it strange not to be able to see the Constituent Assembly, which belongs more to the public than a Congress, its plenary meetings being transparent. I think that politicians and constitution makers will always find a way in corridors or in committee rooms to make the deals that need to be made. But I suppose there has to be a mix between building legitimacy in the Constituent Assembly and letting people know what's happening in their assembly. So certainly, I think in the plenary meetings, but also affording room and time, and that comes down to what happens in the committee rooms and the leadership of the assembly, to make sure that political leaders can meet away from the cameras to come to some agreements.
Muchas gracias, Sumit. Tom, hay una pregunta para ti, pero si también te podrías referir a esta tensión entre la transparencia y lo público y lo privado, desde tu perspectiva creo que sería interesante, porque creo que eso es una de las cuestiones más centrales y de las tensiones más claras. Ahora, junto a eso, don José Miguel Pérez, que es un abogado asesor de pueblos originarios, hace la siguiente pregunta. ¿Cuál es el punto temporal, pasado o futuro, que nos une en una nueva carta fundamental? Es, por una parte, el pasado que nos une como nación a través de una historia común, o bien es el futuro de un sueño ideal común, el que alberga, el que genera, el que permite una multiculturalidad y a veces más de una nación, ¿cierto? Esta pregunta entre la multiculturalidad y la plurinacionalidad. Esas serían dos preguntas juntas para ti, estimado Tom.
Thank you very much. And of course, I didn't have time to talk about many trends that we see around the world, but certainly one trend in many, many countries is to recognize that multiculturalism or plurinational nature of society. And I think in Chile, obviously, this is a major issue. But I'm an outsider. To me, it seems very easy to say that, Chile is one nation with many peoples or something like that, with multiple peoples. That's a common formulation. You mentioned also this question of the balance between the present and the past and the future. And of course, we're all bound by our pasts. I like to use the metaphor of the Constitution has two different functions. It's an operating manual for the government, like you would use for a device or technology, but it's also a blueprint for where we want to go. And it should have some elements of both. If it's only an operating manual, no one's going to care much about it. It doesn't raise passions and people don't love it. But if the ordinary people see a vision for the society that they want to move towards, even if you're not there already, then I think it can help with political support for the Constitution and to communicate that, on an issue like the one you raised, okay, we have a history in Chile, we have some problems, but at least we're working on fixing them. And so I think that is the way I would think about it. And also, just briefly on the transparency, I agree with Sumit. I am in favor of, I would not want these debates to be fully broadcast. I think there could be some sessions that are broadcast, but I would say there must be some room for actual, as I said, bargaining. I think it's really important.
Muy bien. Quiero darle las gracias a la profesora Saunders, a Sumit, a Tom Ginsburg. Quedan naturalmente muchas preguntas, pero debemos ser muy respetuosos con la hora que comprometimos. Hay muchas personas que agradecen las ponencias de los invitados que el día de hoy nos acompañaron. Sin duda son una contribución para lo que tenemos frente a nosotros en nuestro país. Muchas personas les gustaría que pudiéramos repetir esta instancia, así que queda abierta la invitación para ustedes tres. Ojalá existan las condiciones, como dijo Sumit, para que puedan venir a Chile y acompañarnos en esta experiencia que es realmente inédita para la historia constitucional de nuestro país. Horizontal va a seguir generando instancias de diálogo y conversación como esta, y quiero agradecerle una vez más a la Fundación Friedrich Neumann por haber hecho posible este seminario. Nos hubiera encantado poder responder más preguntas, pero estamos seguros que en el futuro van a existir instancias de diálogo para poder responderlas. Así que, muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches. Muchas gracias, Shirley, muchas gracias, Sumit, muchas gracias, Tom.
Excelente.
Muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañaron en este encuentro, el cual, por supuesto, quedará en línea con la traducción simultánea para que todos puedan acceder a estas presentaciones que fueron, sin duda, una gran contribución. Muchas gracias y hasta pronto.